Hi everyone, this is Miss Lasar, and today I'm going to be teaching you about population dynamics. One change for this week's lecture video is that I'm still using black is mandatory, blue is optional, but I've removed the outline format from today's lecture, which means that they're free-form notes. You can choose the organizational structure that works for you. I want to make sure your notes are complete and organized at the end of this, but I want to give you a little more of a challenge to figure out an organizational structure that works for you on your physical paper. Stick with black is mandatory, blue is optional. If you'd like to return to outline format, feel free to use that. Start with capital letters, then numbers, then lowercase letters, then Roman numerals. You know how that works. Or go with something a little bit more freeform. Use diagrams with captions, use bullet points, use spatial organization, whatever works for you so that you'll end up with organized and complete notes at the end of this. Let's get started. So to talk about population dynamics, we have to start by defining a population. This is actually a specific biological concept. A population is a group of individuals of one species that are living in the same area. On the top, we have an individual pine tree and an individual clownfish. On the bottom, we have a population of pine trees and a population of clownfish. So one thing that I want to be careful about is that a population is actually not just all of the clownfish in a particular area. It's the group of clownfish in a particular area that are breeding with each other, that are sharing the same resources, that are sharing the same mates with each other, or competing with each other for the same mates. Let me show you an example of what I mean. On the screen, you can see a map of bobcat populations throughout the Midwest United States. And a lot of students come into this and they say, okay, the population of bobcats is every dot that's on the screen. Every single one of those dots represents one bobcat. Those are all the population of bobcats. But that's not correct. What we actually see is multiple different populations: the green population, the purple population, the red, the yellow, the blue, even the orange population. And we call them distinct populations because they're only interacting with each other. The red bobcats are only going to be looking among other red bobcats for mates. They're going to be sharing the same resources. They're going to be navigating through the same territory. Even though there's a little bit of overlap between red, blue, and yellow, the red bobcats form a distinct population. Okay, another term that you're actually familiar with is population density. And you calculated this during your sampling methods week. This is the number of individuals per unit area. And on the screen, you can see two examples of human populations that have very different densities. On the left, we have a high population density, many individuals packed into an area. And on the right, we see actually a pretty similar geographic area. It's a pretty similar space that you can see in both pictures. But on the right, we have far fewer humans in that same area. So this is our low population density. And we'll return to this concept a little later. For now, just remind yourself of what population density means. This is what you did earlier. How would you determine the population size of these different organisms? A pack of wildebeest or all the wildebeest across the African savanna. We are looking at snow leopards. We're looking at different grass species. We might be looking at different fish species. You've used whatever sampling method works for the situation to determine the size of a particular population. And you've looked at the size of that population over time so that you can see how the size of that population changes. That's our connection to this week. You've used your tagging methods, your trapping methods, mark and recapture, quadrat sampling, transect sampling, and you've done that over time. So you now have a data set of a population over time. You can see when it grew, you can see when it decreased, and you're looking to make predictions or analyze that data. This is called population dynamics, how a population changes over time. We can represent population change with an equation, and it's in black on the top of your screen. Go ahead and write it down. This is an important equation, so you're welcome to put a box around it or use highlighting or underlining to make it stand out from your paper so it's easy to find. Population change is equal to births plus immigration minus deaths plus emigration. Let's actually define each of those terms, even though I'm sure you know what some of them mean. Underneath the equation, please define them. birth. These are animals born into a population. I've put into all in caps because I want to remind myself quickly that births add to a population. Deaths are animals dying out of a population. Immigration is movement of animals into a population. So immigration adds to a population. And emigration is movement of animals out of a population. So emigration and deaths remove animals from a population. Immigration and births add animals into a population. If births are greater than deaths, then the population will grow. We'll be adding more animals than we are removing. But if births are less than deaths, then the population will decline because we are removing more animals than we are adding. Let's do some sample math problems. Here is the same information that you have before, but we're going to write down that same equation from before in a slightly new form. A new population, so not population change, but our new population is equal to our initial population plus births, plus immigration, minus deaths, minus emigration. And we're going to do it in that order. New population equals our initial population plus births plus immigration minus deaths minus emigration. Here's an example. This example will come up in blue. So the example text is optional to write down, but you can see underneath it in black is the required question to write down so that you have a neat problem written in your notebook later on to reference. A population of birds in a forest starts at 100 birds. During 1 year, 12 baby birds are born, 8 old birds die, 4 birds move into the forest, and 6 birds move out of the forest. How big is the bird population at the end of the year? We're going to use our equation. New population equals initial population plus birth plus emigration minus deaths minus emigration. Our initial population, let's plug in numbers. Our initial population is 100. Our births are 12. Our immigrants are 4. We have 4 birds moving into the forest. Our deaths are 8. 8 old birds die. And our emigrants are 6. 6 birds move out of the forest. When we plug that into our calculator, 100 plus 12 plus 4 minus 8 minus 6 equals 102 birds. So our population grew a little bit. Let's look at another example with fish. This part's in blue, so you just need to read it, but then we will have a question in black. A population of sturgeon, that is this fish species, in a lake starts at 100 fish. During 1 year, 50% of the population successfully reproduces. Each pair has 2 offspring. That means that 50% of the population has 1 baby, and 10% are eaten by predators. The pond is closed off, so there is no immigration or emigration. How big is the fish population at the end of year 1? Okay, here's our same equation. New population equals initial population plus births plus immigration minus deaths minus emigration. Let's plug it in. Births is 100 times 50% because 50% of our fish are replacing themselves or having a baby. So 50% of our fish is 50% of 100. That's 50 new fish that are born. 10% of our fish are dying because they're eaten by predators. So 100 times 0.1 times 10% equals 10. We have no immigration and no emigration. Let's plug these numbers into our equation below. Our new population equals our original 100 plus our births 50 minus our deaths 10. No immigrants, no emigrants. So our new population equals 140 sturgeon fish. Follow-up question, if we end year 1 with 140 sturgeon fish, how big is the fish population at the end of year 2? Same conditions, 50% successfully reproduce, 10% are eaten by predators. But now we're looking at year 2. Remember, the population at the end of year 1 was 140 fish. So now this is our new initial population. We plug it in. Our births is 140 times 0.5 or 50%, so we have 70 births. Our deaths is 140 times 10% or 0.1. We have 14 deaths. We plug in those numbers. Our year 2 population equals initial 140 plus our births 70 minus our deaths 14. final population is 196 sturgeon at the end of year 2. You might notice that we increased by 40 in year 1, but we increased by 56 in year 2, so we added even more fish. Let's keep going for 15 years. Draw a chart on your paper. My T chart is going to go down pretty far. It's going to go down for 15 rows. You could keep this neat by putting two T charts side by side, or you could extend this down for 15 rows and write notes on the right side of the T chart. The left side of the T chart is year, the right side is population. And we're numbering our years from 0 down to 15. In year 0, when we started, we had 100 fish. At the end of year 1, we calculated that we had 140 fish. At the end of year 2, 196. At the end of year 3, if we continue the same calculations that you just did for 2 years, we would have 274 fish. Whoa, we added almost 100 fish. At the end of year 4, 384. At the end of year 5, 538. So between 4 and 5, we actually added over 100 fish. Notice how we're adding more fish every year. At the end of year 6, 753. At the end of 7, 1,054. 1,476. Whoa, we're adding more than 400 fish in 1 year now, when we started with only 100. Whoa, things increase quickly. At the end of year 9, 2,066. At the end of year 10, 2,893. 4,050. 5,669. 7,937. 11,112. And 15,557. Between year 14 and year 15, we added about 4,000 new fish. Whoa. If we turn this into a graph, which you are welcome to sketch small on the side of your chart, it would look like this, where a population starts very small. And as we go and extend that population over time, here's year 15. We get up to about 15,000 fish. If I extend out to year 20, oh my gosh, we're going to be up to 75,000 fish in 20 years from a population of just 100 sturgeons. This is an incredible increase. Here's the claim that we can make about this data. Over time, the sturgeon population increases, and each year it increases more than it did the year before. We added 40 fish, then 56 fish, then almost 100 fish, and by the end, we're adding almost 4,000 fish in a year. This type of growth is called, in black, you gotta write it down, exponential growth. This is a really important term. I have underlined exponential growth. Feel free to make this stand out on your paper. Exponential growth is when a population's growth rate stays the same, regardless of population size, making the population grow faster and faster as it gets larger. I know it sounds contradictory to say that the growth rate stays the same and that the population grows faster and faster, but the growth rate that I'm referring to is that 50% reproduction rate and 10% death rate. If those two numbers stay the same, when we have larger and larger populations, they'll grow faster and faster and faster, and we'll end up with a graph that looks like this, a curve, a graph that is curving upwards and getting faster and faster as the population gets larger and larger. However, you might have started thinking about that sturgeon population and wondering, is our fish pond really big enough to hold 75,000 sturgeon? In 20 years, will we actually have that many? Well, no, we won't, because exponential growth never happens forever. Eventually, the population will run out of something, space, food, etc., and the growth rate will slow down. At that point, our graph will transition from this increasing increase to something that levels out. We start off with a quick increase, and then eventually our growth rate slows until we level out. This type of growth is called logistic growth, when a population's growth rate gets smaller and smaller as population size approaches a maximum. So even though I say the population's growth rate gets smaller, I'm not saying that the population size gets smaller. The population is still increasing in size until it eventually approaches a maximum, level where it stabilizes and stays roughly constant. So here are our two types of growth: exponential growth on the left, logistic growth on the right. What you might notice is that they're connected. Exponential growth is the beginning of logistic growth. Logistic growth starts with exponential growth, but then it transitions to logistic growth as the population starts being limited by stuff and the growth rate slows down and slows down until our population stabilizes. So, why don't population sizes keep increasing exponentially? What factors influence population size? Well, those factors that influence population size, like I mentioned before, space, food, resources, etc., are called limiting factors. A limiting factor is something that limits the growth or abundance or distribution of a population. Here are some examples. Food availability. How much food is there in the environment? Space availability. Can we expand? Disease. If a population is really abundant, it may actually experience higher rates of disease because there are more hosts for the disease to travel through and spread through. Competition for resources or mates. If a population is really small, it might actually not have a lot of mates. As the population grows bigger, it might have more mates available. But as the population grows bigger, it's also going to start competing for resources more fiercely. Predators. The presence of predators will limit the size of a population. A natural disaster or climate change can limit the size of a population. A natural disaster like a hurricane could wipe out a population. As climate changes, an area might become too hot for a population to survive. So these examples of limiting factors actually have a distinction. We're going to separate these into two groups. It's going to be based on their effect on these two groups: a population on the left that has a high population density, or one on the right that has a low population density. Some limiting factors will affect these two regions very differently. For example, which area will have more competition for resources? Definitely the one on the left. So, competition for resources will affect these two areas differently. They'll feel it in different ways. Some limiting factors will have the same effect on these two areas. If it gets too cold or too hot for humans to live, both areas are going to feel the effect of that temperature change equally. So this brings us to our separation. I've highlighted in blue the top 5 factors. What I would recommend is putting a bracket like this around them so that you can see that those top 5 factors are all linked. Those top 5 factors are what are called density dependent factors. These are factors whose effects on the size or the growth of a population vary with the population density. They affect a high and a low density population differently. And we talked about competition for resources. That's a really easy one to understand. A dense population will have way more competition for resources than a diffuse or spread out population. But a dense population will have much more mates available more easily than a spread out population. Disease will affect a dense population more than a spread out one. It'll spread through the dense population faster. Predators will be able to find food in a dense population more quickly than in a spread out population. Food availability, so food and space availability, both have to do with density because a dense population will have more competition for food and will have more competition for space than a spread out population. But as we said, our last one, natural disaster and climate, this is a density independent factor, a factor whose effect on the size or the growth of a population does not change with the population density. If a certain area becomes too salty for freshwater fish to survive in, all of the freshwater fish will have to move out of the area or will die. And it doesn't matter how many freshwater fish there are in the area. If it's too salty for them to survive, they can't survive and stay there anymore. That's a density independent factor. Putting all these factors together, we get the carrying capacity of an environment. Carrying capacity is also abbreviated as capital K. This is the maximum number of organisms that an environment can stably hold. I put stably in bold. You could underline it. You could do something to make it stand out because that is important. It's not just the maximum number of organisms that we can squish into a place. It's the maximum number of organisms that can survive there year after year, reproduce, die off, refresh themselves, immigrate, emigrate, and stably stay around that same maximum. 3 things to know about carrying capacity. Number 1, carrying capacity depends on the organism and the environment. Different organisms within an ecosystem will have different carrying capacities. When we look at a food web, we're going to have one carrying capacity for our tertiary consumers and a different carrying capacity for our primary producers. We can estimate our carrying capacity through population size data, and I'll show you how to do that when we look at graphs in a moment. And finally, carrying capacity can change as the environment changes. So I'm going to show you a graph with carrying capacity marked in a moment. Don't draw this graph. I'm going to have you draw a better graph in a moment. Here's the graph. So in this graph, we can see logistic growth. We start with exponential growth, and then our population growth rate slows until we stabilize at this level, and we've marked this level as the carrying capacity. So we found where the population stabilizes, and then we draw a horizontal line until it touches the y-axis, and that population on the y-axis, that is the carrying capacity for this population. We saw this population grow and grow and grow and grow and grow until it stabilized around a carrying capacity. But the reason that I'm not having you draw this graph is because this doesn't really represent reality. In reality, populations are never going to show us a beautiful, perfect stabilization where all of a sudden the population stays exactly at the same size forevermore. What they're really going to show us is something more like this, where we see exponential growth. And then as our population approaches its carrying capacity, marked in the red dotted line, it overshoots the carrying capacity. And then as it overshoots, there's too many individuals, there's not enough resources to support them, and so some die off, and we go below our carrying capacity. But when we're below our carrying capacity, there's more resources that individuals can use. Reproduction happens at greater rates. Our population increases. We're back to a die-off, an increase, a die-off, and then we will continue fluctuating around our carrying capacity. So this is the graph that I'd like you to sketch on your paper next to carrying capacity. I'd like you to sketch this wiggly green line. I'd like you to label the part that shows exponential growth. I'd like you to draw the red dotted line right around the center of the fluctuations, label it carrying capacity, and I'd like you to label your axes. Your y-axis is population or population size, and your x-axis is time. Go ahead and sketch this on your paper now. 2 more things to know. This is a summary of the graph. Growing populations typically overshoot and undershoot the carrying capacity. That's what you see in the peak valley, peak valley, peak valley. We have overshoots and undershoots, overshoots and undershoots. Here's another way of saying that. Growing and stable populations fluctuate around the carrying capacity. These are called fluctuations, going above, going below, going above, going below. Those are fluctuations. Most ecosystems have established populations fluctuating around their carrying capacity. Here's one example. A song sparrow population in its natural habitat. You can see how its population fluctuates over the years. If we had to estimate a carrying capacity here, I would draw a horizontal line in between most of the fluctuations. I would get a carrying capacity right around here, maybe 35 sparrows. Here's another example of established populations fluctuating. We've got moose in red and wolves in blue. And this actually shows one of the reasons that populations fluctuate. As we get more moose, the wolves who eat them start eating more moose. They're able to reproduce at higher levels because they have more nutrition. The wolf population peaks until they've eaten too many moose, and the moose population crashes because they're all getting eaten. And as the moose population crashes, well, we've got too many wolves and not enough moose to feed them, so our wolf population crashes as well. And this goes over and over and over. Our 2 populations fluctuate depending on each other. This is predator-prey relationships. And since in our ecosystems we have established food webs where organisms are eating each other, we see population booms and busts, overshoots and undershoots, fluctuations as different populations take advantage of resources, die off as resources become unavailable, take advantage of resources, and die off again. But we will see new growth in some interesting new populations. Some new populations might grow exponentially. Here are some examples where you might see exponential growth instead of fluctuation around a carrying capacity. You might see exponential growth when bacteria colonize a petri dish. That exponential growth will eventually transition to logistic growth as the bacteria run out of space or food. The introduction of an invasive species, when we introduce an invasive species to a new area, it's got unlimited space, resources, habitats. It's going to grow exponentially until it reaches a maximum. A new virus spreading in a population is a new population with tons of hosts available, unlimited resources. It can reproduce wildly, exponentially, until it reaches a stable maximum. And a reintroduction of a keystone species like wolves into Yellowstone Park. That wolf population starts off really low as it's reintroduced, and as they reproduce, as they're reintroduced, and then as they reproduce and reproduce and reproduce, to take advantage of all of the resources and space that are available, they'll grow exponentially until they reach that stable maximum, at which point they transition to logistic growth and fluctuate around the carrying capacity. So how do we represent population growth? We're going to write down an example of sturgeon population growth. Remember our original fish population in a lake. And I'd like you to set up this graph properly on your paper. So set it up with a x-axis labeled time, a y-axis labeled number of sturgeon, population size of sturgeon, and a title, sturgeon growth over time. You're going to be making a lot of population graphs during this unit, and you're going to be analyzing a lot of population graphs during this unit. You want to make sure that they're always set up like this, with time on the x-axis and population size or number of sturgeon, for example, on the y-axis. The initial growth of the sturgeon population will start slow. We're initially stocking just a few sturgeon into the pond, and we see slow initial growth. There's lots of space and food available, but there's little reproduction because there's not that many sturgeon in the pond. But as the sturgeon do reproduce, there are more mates available, and our reproduction will start to increase. And so our growth starts speeding up. There's still lots of space and food available and lots of reproduction. We're seeing exponential growth. Eventually, growth is super fast. Lots of space and food is still available. There's so much reproduction until our sturgeon population starts pushing up against the limits of the environment. They might start running out of space first because it looks like they're getting pretty packed together. At this point, our growth will slow and will eventually level out. There will not be enough food and space for all the new fish. We'll see an overshoot and undershoot and overshoot and undershoot, and those fluctuations will continue around the carrying capacity of the sturgeon. We should mark our carrying capacity by drawing our dashed line horizontally between the fluctuations, extend it all the way to the y-axis, label it carrying capacity, and where it hits on the y-axis, that is our carrying capacity that we've estimated for the number of sturgeon in the pond. Practice. What is the carrying capacity of this bacterial species living in this petri dish? Is it 0 colonies per milliliter, 50 colonies per milliliter, 75 colonies per milliliter, or 100 colonies per milliliter? Pause the video, decide on your answer, press play when you're ready. Here's the answer. I'm drawing a horizontal line at the point where the population stabilizes, and I stretch that out over to the y-axis, see where that hits. That hits at about 75 colonies per milliliter, and that is my carrying capacity. But we know that populations don't just perfectly stabilize like this, they fluctuate. They might like something like this. So I don't see initial exponential growth here. I see a series of fluctuations, and each fluctuation actually shows me a little bit of exponential growth and then it crashes, a little bit of exponential growth, then it crashes. This is what deer populations looked like in Yellowstone Park over 10 years. What is the deer carrying capacity? 0 deer, 175,000 deer, 3,000 deer, or there's not enough information. So here's how I solve this. I extend my horizontal line in the middle of all the fluctuations. Imagine to yourself where that would be. Here it is. I stretch that horizontal line all the way to the y-axis. It hits there. 1.75 thousand deer. That's my approximate carrying capacity. Final section. What impacts the carrying capacity of the environment? Well, a bunch of things do. Resource availability, habitat availability, if any of the limiting factors change. Was predators a primary limiting factor and then all the predators were wiped out by a disease? Well, now your carrying capacity is a lot higher because you can support more individuals now that there's fewer predators. And humans, we can change carrying capacity. Human disturbances like climate change or deforestation or lack of food, all of these things can impact the carrying capacity of an environment. Here's some examples. Carrying capacity can increase if there is more space available for growth. If we transfer our bacteria into a larger petri dish, the carrying capacity of the environment changes because there's more space to support them. Or it can increase if there's more food available for animals. Let's say there's extra rain one year and our acorn production is extra high. Now, with more acorns, the carrying capacity for animals in that year alone is higher because there's more food available for them. Carrying capacity can decrease if deforestation decreases food or habitat space for animals. If we cut down a whole bunch of forest, we've lost all of the habitat spaces for the animals that live there. It can also decrease if, in our coral reef, climate change kills a bunch of the corals because of rising temperatures in the sea. With all of that dead coral, we have a loss of available habitats for animals. So, same deal. One of our organisms dies or is removed by humans, or the climate changes and some organisms die as a result. That's going to decrease the carrying capacity for anybody that relies on that thing. So here we've got, in our bottom example, we've got a density independent factor killing our corals. That is water temperature. As the water temperature gets higher, it will impact all corals equally, regardless of how dense or spread out they are. So it was a density independent factor that basically killed all of our corals, brought our carrying capacity for coral down to 0, and then impacted the carrying capacity for all of the organisms that live in the coral, like the fish species that live in the coral reefs. Now their carrying capacity is much lower because they might rely on the living coral for some of their needs. And that would be a density dependent factor because those fish are now going to be competing with each other for the limited live coral or limited intact habitat spaces that are still available. Okay, this was our lecture on population dynamics. I hope you enjoyed some of the complex interactions that we see. I hope you've made your graphs beautiful and you will use these notes for the rest of the week. Great job. Thanks for watching, people.